language of the torturers. They were quotes saying, "We'll give the North Vietnamese one more turn of the screw," or "let's try the water drop technique." And I was thinking, what is this? How can the leaders of our country be talking in this language and then misleading the American public? And then I just started to cry because I knew that he really had to give them out. And so there were tears in my eyes, and I came out and I just said, do it.
I walked into this hotel room when he and I holed up, and Neil says, "Rick, look at what we've got." And I mean, it was just staggering. The raw, top-secret, eyes-only documents. From Earl Wheeler to General Westmoreland, from Johnson to Taylor. You could go back and see, yes, Kennedy did send in troops in violation of the Geneva Accord. Yes, Johnson did start the buildup before he said he was going to. I remember writing this story. These guys were lying through their teeth when they were talking to us. And here it is in black and white. There's no way of denying it.
The editors immediately understood that this thing was so sensitive and was going to have to be kept under wraps. And so they decided to move the whole thing out of the New York Times offices and to go and rent a suite at the Hilton.
There were a lot of difficult, important decisions to be made, and we needed to know the material in order to make those decisions, and that took time. And Ellsberg couldn't understand that. Ellsberg was constantly pressing. He always wanted to know, when was the Times going to run this? Was the Times really going to run this? Was it really going to be big? When was it going to happen?
As a source, I sort of thought of myself as being on the team somehow, you know, and that we were at a joint First Amendment informing the public kind of mission and, you know, working together. They clearly didn't think of me in that way.
Once somebody gave us material, it was our job to determine what to do with it, how to play it, what to use, whether or not to use it. And Neil and I, after we got a feel for what was in there, argued that we could go ahead, that this would not jeopardize national security, and indeed it was a public service.
All I knew was they had a bunch of classified papers. And the question for me as a lawyer is, can you publish classified papers? The law here is the statute called the Espionage Act. I mean, if you read it and stretched it and pushed it, it was possible to apply it to the publication of the Pentagon Papers.
We're sitting there down in the engine room doing the work. We're not up at the corporate hierarchy, but we're hearing the battles going on up there, and we hear that, and of course, the news comes to us because we're at risk too. The law firm the Times had used for decades said, don't publish, and by the way, you're all violating the Espionage Act and you're going to go to jail. Believe me, we heard that. And happily, Jim Goodale, as the Times in-house attorney, took a different position.
The risk that the New York Times took was a life and death risk of an institution. And I don't mean the 5,000 people who work for the Times. I mean the leader of the institutional press in a free country.
Lurking in the backs of our minds was the fact that we would never survive just suppressing this material, that sooner or later it would be known that we had it and that we had flinched and that we had not published it and that would have been such a disgrace.
And we heard the publisher wavered back and forth, and then finally, about 10 days, while we're gearing up this, what were we publishing? Gone with the Wind 3 times over in 10 days? I mean, this was a huge project. We finally hear the publisher had signed off and was going to agree to do it. And I remember that Jimmy Greenfield told us he was taking the publisher golfing on Saturday, which was the day the presses ran, to make sure the publisher didn't change his mind.
I guess it was a Saturday night. The four of us, Dan and Pat Ellsberg and my wife, decided we'd go to the movies, see a movie that Dan Ellsberg, I think, had seen 7 times and wanted to see again, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I could see that Dan was agitated in some way, and I asked him what was going on, and he said he had called a friend on the New York Times And this friend of his said, well, I can't talk to you now. The Times building is encircled by armed guards, and the printing presses are rolling, and we are printing tomorrow a top-secret government document.
This weekend, portions of a highly classified Pentagon document came to light for all the world to see and brought cries of outrage from Washington.
The Pentagon papers make it abundantly clear how little the public knew of what was going on behind the scenes during...
Its main effect is to refute the notion that we stumbled into the war. At the White House, a spokesman said President Nixon got his first look at the secret report when a copy was delivered to him today.
This goddamn New York Times expose of the most highly classified documents of the war.
You mean that was leaked out of the Pentagon?
Sir, this is a devastating security breach of the greatest magnitude of anything I've ever seen.
Did we know this was coming out?
No, we did not, sir.
I'd just start right at the top and fire some people. I mean, whatever department it came out of, I'd fire the top guy.
The first issue they ran had a paragraph from Assistant Secretary of Defense to Secretary McNamara. I can almost tell it by memory. We're in Vietnam, 10% to help the South Vietnamese, 20% to hold back the Chinese, and 70% to save American face. Well, every woman in America that had a boyfriend or a husband, they could take it if we were defending the South Vietnamese, but to learn we're just trying to save face, that is a thing that angers you.
Monday was a very interesting day. I came back to the New York Times, hustled on the elevator, went up to the top executive floor. There was the biggest shouting argument ever in my life. A telegram that had come from John Mitchell, Nixon's Attorney General. The telegram said, we want you to stop publication immediately, and if you don't, we're going to take appropriate action. I mean, what in God's name have we been fighting for in this country for 200 or 300 years, to have the right to speak and the right to publish, the right to think against a threat by the government, if all we're going to do is give it all up because someone sends you a telegram?
Now listen here, printing top secret information. I don't care how they feel about the war, whether they're for it or against it. You can or should not do it. It's an attack on the integrity of government. And by God, I'm going to fight that son of a bitching paper. They don't know what's going to hit them now.
A federal court has ordered the New York Times to stop publication temporarily. The government asked for and got an injunction against the Times.
Before the Nixon administration enjoined the New York Times, there had never been another injunction brought against a media company in a federal court.
A name has now come out as the possible source of the Times Pentagon documents. It is that of Daniel Ellsberg, 40 years old, one-time Marine, later a top policy analyst for the Defense and State Departments during the Vietnam buildup.
There was no sign of Professor Ellsberg or his family at their home in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And we're looking on the television, the morning news, and we notice that the FBI is at our little apartment in Cambridge. And we say we can't go back. We go to a motel for a couple of nights under false names. We don't have any clothes, we don't have a toothbrush, we don't have anything.
He knew they'd be looking for him. He knew they'd be looking to arrest him. And he wanted to have an opportunity to give the papers to more newspapers.
I came out of a 3 o'clock meeting the day after the Times had been enjoined, and my deputy said, maybe you better look at this. I dialed a number, and a voice said, if I can get you what you want, will you print them? I said, damn well we'll print them.
The Post picked up the Pentagon story where the Times left off, but was ordered to halt its publication of the material in the court ruling last night.
There was no way of knowing when the New York Times and Washington Post could resume publication of the papers, if at all. This could be the end, unless other newspapers were willing to defy the government. I had heard that Senator Mike Gravel would do a daily filibuster until the draft expired.
Well, I'm just chugging along with my filibuster, and I get a phone call, and I don't know who it is. He says immediately, "Is this Senator Girl?" I said, "Yes, it is." He says, "Would you read the Pentagon Papers as part of your filibuster?" I said, "Yes. Now, please hang up."